So what are the key features of a C3 organization? First, you are required by the Internal Revenue Code to fill out an application to obtain that status unless you are a church. Otherwise, you must obtain that status using the 1023 form, which I'll talk about in a second. Once the exemption is approved by the IRS, however, as I mentioned, your related income will be free from federal tax. And contributions to the C3 will be tax deductible to the donor to the extent permitted by law based upon their circumstances. So what are the types of a C3? We have public charities, which is the preferred status in most cases when we're dealing with our clients. Again, there are statutory categories: churches, schools, hospitals. Churches don't even have to fill out the 1023, but they're by definition a C3. And then there are the rest that have some charitable purpose, but in order for them to maintain the C3 status, they have to satisfy a public support test. And that means that there are certain criteria. I can refer you to Schedule A of the IRS Form 990 that pretty well sets out what that criteria is in order to meet the public support test. But you have to be in business to be supporting the public in some way in order to achieve and maintain the status. I once had a client that was wanting to set up, it was a Christmas tree association, and they wanted to achieve C3 status. The IRS rejected it because there was no public support to it. There was no public purpose. It benefited the association and the Christmas tree growers, but even though we all like to have our trees, they weren't giving the trees away for free, so it didn't meet the public support test. A private foundation, which is the default status under C3 if you don't meet the public support test, they're going to be ones that are funded by a small group of private donors typically. There's a corporate foundation status that you might get. But they might also be a C3 depending upon if they're solely funded by the corporation or if they are also achieving public support from solicitations or fundraising events or other things independent of the corporate foundation. And we work a lot with our corporate foundations to try to maintain that status so that there's enough of a percentage coming from the public and not all coming from the corporate funder. They're subject to much more stringent and complicated rules than public charities. They have expenditure requirements and things that are similar or along those lines, and they have a lower deductibility in many cases. So the C3 status is, again, the preferred status, and it will be what I'm going to focus on today. The foundation side of things would be too much for a 1-hour presentation today. So I mentioned the statutory categories. They're religious. The definition is religious, charitable, or scientific, testing for public safety, literary, educational. Specifically also mentioned are fostering national or international amateur sports competition or the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. Again, you must be a corporation, community chest fund, articles of association or foundation, and an example of a qualifying organization would include a nonprofit old age home, a parent-teacher association, charitable hospitals, or other charitable type organizations, alumni associations, schools, the Red Cross. So those are the various kinds of examples of C3 organizations. What are the benefits of a C3? Why wouldn't you want to just start a nonprofit? And in many instances in these days, you will hear a lot about social hybrid organizations or social venture organizations. Why not just start one of those? And I think most often the reason that I would hear is because we want to be able to have our donors be able to achieve tax deduction for their contributions. Because if you don't have the C3 status, people can invest in your organization, but they won't be able to have the deduction. So again, eligible for tax-deductible contributions. Again, tax-free status. So many state and local property tax exemptions might apply, and there could be other tax exemptions at the state level. You could have diverse funding opportunities between the public and corporations, sponsors, those kinds of things. There's also reduced postal rates. We have a lot of back and forth on that these days, but so far the postal rates reductions stay in place for our charity clients, and you could achieve exemption for federal unemployment tax. I just want to mention, in my experience from when I was actually on the regulator side in Pennsylvania, we had a lot of C4 fire departments were often qualifying as C4 status rather than C3. And there is a tiny component of a 501c4 section that would qualify not just for tax exemption, but also for contributions. They have to, though, be used only for the public purposes of the organization. If they're a C4, I should mention, is a civic or social advocacy type organization. But if you're falling under the civic or social side and you're using the contributions for purely public purposes, those contributions could also be tax deductible. The other section where you might have tax deductible contributions would be under C19, which is a war veteran organization. And so contributions to that kind of organization might also be tax deductible. But the rest of the C organizations would not be able to accept tax deductible contributions. So great, burdens sound great, but the benefits sound great. What are the burdens? Well, there are many. It requires greater transparency and public accountability. There's a lot of scrutiny. And these days, it's not just the IRS or the state charity officials that are really scrutinizing the media. The Federal Trade Commission is now very heavily involved. There are watchdog organizations, and each of them have their own view about what makes a good organization versus a bad one. We sometimes do a presentation called Who's Watching You Now, and we mention the IRS, the states, other federal government agencies such as Congress, Senate, Postal Service, the FTC, the watchdog organizations. GuideStar is putting information out there to make it easy for people to be able to see what charities are doing. The Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance has a set of 20 standards that they expect you to meet. Charity Navigator, Charity Watch, and there are others. I was just looking the other day for something, and I came across a site that talks about charity fraud in a way that I hadn't seen before, involved in crowdfunding. So I think as the internet continues to present creative opportunities, we will continue to see creative ways of monitoring the charitable sector. And I should mention, too, grant-making agencies are becoming much more interested in scrutinizing organizations and putting specific requirements in place in order to be able to achieve funding. Funding opportunities are becoming more competitive, so that presents a sort of another way of scrutinizing the sector. The Form 990 information is readily available publicly, as I mentioned, on GuideStar. Many of the states are starting to put it up on their websites. The application, if anybody asks for it, has to be made available. There are greater compliance and reporting burdens, particularly for organizations that lobby or fundraise in multiple states. And at the end of the day, your activities have to be doing more than just accomplishing some good. They have to primarily fulfill the exempt or charitable purpose for which the status was received. I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about fundraising compliance and what we are seeing with the state charity officials and what their expectations are for how charities are operating. The states are also a feeder into the Internal Revenue Service. So if they see things that are wrong, they think it falls in this last category, that a charity really isn't operating as a charity anymore, well, then the IRS might get involved and audit the organization on top of whatever is happening at the state level. The other thing that's happening, many of you or all of you on watching now may be aware of the multi-state action that happened with the Federal Trade Commission at the lead. It's the first time in history that all 50 states have come together to be able to prosecute organizations, and it involved 4 different cancer charities. And the FTC being at the center of it, I think, is really what allowed it to happen, so that there was one central place. They could file it in federal court, and all of the states simply just had to sign on to it. It was successful from their perspective. All 4 organizations are now dissolved, and I think there's going to be some long-lasting reverberations from that. based upon other players involved. And I think that with the FTC now being able to do this, they have to be able to demonstrate the charity is a sham charity, which falls into this category. Sham meaning it's not really a charity. They're not really doing anything charitable. They exist more for the benefit of either fundraisers or for the officers of the organization, but certainly not for the benefit of the public. And that was the theory in that case. And I think that now that we're able to much more effectively communicate across state lines through the internet and through the FTC at the center of it, I think stay tuned. You might see more cases like that.